where the legends play. Willie 1550 and 98.7. Hello there, I'm Kenny Graves, and on the phone with me right now, he is a board-certified neuropsychologist who specializes in evaluating and treating patients with cognitive impairment, dementia, ADHD, and traumatic brain injury. He has a new book out now called Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. Dr. Mitchell Clionsky. How are you, Doctor?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to be on your show, Kenny.
A pleasure to have you on, sir. Now, you did write this book with your wife, Dr. Emily Clionsky, as well, correct?
She is a physician. She's an internist and a psychiatrist. And yes, if you want to ever do the stress test on your marriage, try writing a book with your spouse.
Well, duly
it's a
noted.
lovely thing, if you survive.
Well, duly noted, Doctor, duly noted. Well, give us kind of a quick recap of your background. You're an expert in the field, so give us your history.
Well, I've seen dementia from both sides, whether you view this as a fortunate or unfortunate event. I've been evaluating people, doing neuropsychological tests of memory and attention and problem solving for 35 years. And my practice, see upwards of 1,000 people a year, of which about 500 of them come in for memory loss and other related conditions. So I have an extensive background, as does Emily, in terms of evaluating and also treating people over the course of their illness. I also have the unfortunate fact of my own mother coming down with dementia back in her 70s and living with that for the 10 years until ultimately she passed. So I've been on both sides of that desk as the therapist and evaluator and also as the family member of a patient.
Yes, sir.
And as you know, and your listeners know, it's a terrible disease. But there is an optimistic note here, which is while it is a terrible disease, the newest statistics now tell us that between 40 to 60% of dementias, in other words, averaging 1 out of 2 people, can prevent themselves from developing dementia if they do an evaluation of what's going on with their health and if they take active steps to prevent their cognitive decline. And that's what our book is all about.
Outstanding. Well, what, Doctor, is the current definition of dementia? What forms can it take, and what is known to cause it?
It is a progressive neurological decline. In other words, a disease of the brain in which the connections between brain cells and the actual size of the brain changes, shrinks over the course of time. It's caused by a wide variety of conditions. While people typically think of Alzheimer's disease as being dementia, we now know that vascular conditions, hardening of the arteries, as we used to call it, but blood circulation is very much involved both in strokes and heart attacks that can ultimately lead to cognitive changes, but also diabetes and problems with blood circulation. So when we look at, there's Alzheimer's disease, there's the vascular conditions which often overlap that. We also have dementias due to Parkinson's disease, dementias due to alcohol abuse, dementias due to repeated blows to the brain, what they now call chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We used to call it punch drunkenness back in the day. Dementia pugilistica was the Latin term for that. But it's actually a number of things, some of which you can't do much about. Certainly there's some genetic backgrounds that doom a person, whether it's Huntington's disease, 1 out of 2 people who have that gene are going to get that disease and die from it. On the other hand, there's so many people who they only have the background in the same way you and I might have heart disease, and yet there's things we can do in lifestyle and our habits that reduce that risk dramatically.
Well, for the listeners, right quick, and myself, what are some early onset signs to look for? What is the difference? How do you know you're not just getting a little older and being a little forgetful on some things, or to the fact you need to probably go see a doctor and get evaluated?
That is a $1 million question because there's a huge overlap between normal cognitive aging and early signs of dementia. Oftentimes it's only in the rearview mirror that we're able to say, yeah, I could see this beginning back then. What we're working on currently is the test that we developed called the Memory Orientation Screening Test, which has been out now for about 10 years, 4 very large-scale peer-reviewed studies showing that's valid, only takes 5 minutes for a doctor to do, and it's been used by hundreds of doctors, but not nearly enough. We're now in the process of trying to develop a home version of this so that you, sitting down with your mom, for example, in about 5 to 10 minutes could say, I don't like your score on that. Let me send this over to your doctor, let you go in. That's going to be the first warning sign to get you in for a more formal evaluation. But basically, whatever we can do to bring heightened awareness to early intervention. But even if we don't have that, every one of us should be actively working on changing our health habits so that we can prevent the reduction or cause the reduction in our risk. And then if it happens, it happens. We've done our best. But we really should be working early on to make changes in how we live our lives.
Well, Doctor, what roles do genes, early life experience, and gender play in regards to a person's dementia risk?
Well, genes are the background. They're like the stone that's quarried and has some ripples in it, but you're going to make a statue out of it. You have to work around the ripples. Those genetic background factors are there. Only a small percentage of people are they the predominant factor, however. About 98% people don't have a strong genetic cause. As for gender, women have this a little more than men, partially because they live longer than men do, and dementia increases in its likelihood as we get older. Also may be that the loss of estrogen after menopause causes women to be at higher risk, whereas in their earlier years, they're at lower risk because the estrogen protects them. So that's a factor. Environment, we know that if you are unfortunate enough to grow up in areas where there's air pollution, water pollution, where you're in stressful situations, we also know that you're at a higher risk for this. We also know that people in poverty and who are not having good sources of food supplies are at increasingly higher risk, so that it also is more possible and likely in black and brown communities versus white communities. So there's a racial bias to this as well that we need to change from a systematic basis as opposed to simply an individual basis.
All right, what are some areas you would not normally consider as factors or markers of developing dementia?
Yeah, those are the interesting ones. For example, hearing loss. Even subtle hearing loss increases the risk of developing dementia because your brain is not getting stimulated enough during the course of everyday activities. So at this point, we're probably sending 70% of our patients out for hearing tests because if we can discover that they've got a hearing loss, and with the ease of now getting hearing aids, we know that we can improve their cognitive functioning as well as their relationships with other people because they keep asking, what'd you say? What'd you say? If we can get them to wear hearing aids during the day, that'll help to prevent this. So that's one of those. We've known for a long time that smoking and excessive drinking are significant factors. What we haven't paid enough attention to is what's called the anticholinergic burden, which is medications which sometimes your doctors prescribe, but also that you can often buy over the counter for things like sleep aids. Those things with the PM at the end, such and such PM, contain something called diphenhydramine, otherwise known as Benadryl. Chronic use of those can lead to decreased cognition. We also know that if you're on any of the anti-anxiety medications, the benzodiazepines, the Valiums, Libriums, medications, lorazepams, things like that, for prolonged periods of time, you run a higher risk of dementia. So sometimes there's a deprescribing. Everyone says, well, what should our doctor prescribe? Well, sometimes it's what shouldn't your doctor prescribe to improve your risk. That's why in our book we have a risk questionnaire that people fill out, both either on the actual book or online at our website, and can assess their areas of whether they're on target and where they're off target in terms of their dementia risk. It gives you a starting point for what you're going to do to fix some of this.
All right, doctor, what are some easy things people can do that will drastically reduce their risk of developing dementia? This is the one everybody wants to hear.
I know, and it's not an answerable question. Easy and drastic improvement don't go together, because if they did, you'd have already done it. And I bristle when I hear people say, well, just tie your tie in a different way or take a different route to work. Yeah, that's fine and it's easy. The problem is it's not really effective. And that's why we wrote this book. If it were a matter of downloading something from a website and saying, I just have to do these easy things, take this over-the-counter supplement, we wouldn't need to write this book and we wouldn't have people going into nursing homes because those things don't work. Oftentimes, it's a matter of changing our lifestyle, increasing exercise, walking 10 minutes a day, 3 times a day. A 10-minute walk 3 times a day will dramatically change your risk for dementia because you now are getting 210 minutes of exercise a week. And that's a lot more than most people get. Sedentary lifestyle, which oftentimes causes people to get overweight, causes them to develop diabetes, relates to a whole lot of interpersonal problems because they're withdrawn and sitting at home, lying on the couch. All that kind of stuff is bad for you. So if we get people walking and moving, that's a big thing. Also, if we can get them to pay attention to whether or not they are breathing effectively while they sleep. A condition called obstructive sleep apnea is very much overlooked, but very important, because if we're not getting enough air down our lungs while we're asleep, we're not getting enough oxygen to our brains. This causes us not to be able to think well, increases our risk of heart attack and stroke, and also increases our risk of dementia. So we're big proponents of having people get sleep studies, whether it's a home sleep study or an in-lab sleep study, to determine if they're breathing properly. That can make a huge difference in many people's lives.
What about diet? Is there something people need to start weaning themselves or limiting what they're taking in of certain foods?
Well, we know that complex carbohydrates, the kind of stuff that's, in a lot of the breads and pastas and the cakes and pies, you have to really monitor how much of that you're having. Same way with sugars. We really, these days, people talk about the MIND diet, the Mediterranean diet. They're heavier on olive oil rather than butter. They're heavier on vegetables and plant-based kinds of things. And that plays a part. Certainly diet does. But, the people who are watching their diet are also the same people who are moving more and exercising, who are more actively engaged in using their mind. It's a complex situation. And that's why no one thing. It's okay, well, if I just eat more green leafy vegetables, that will do the trick. Untrue. It's too simple. Again, if it was so simple, you would have already been doing it.
Understood. Well, what is the history of dementia research over the last 50 to 75 years, and what are the latest breakthroughs?
Well, there were some big breakthroughs back in the 1990s where they came out with a couple classes of medications. One of them deals with supporting an already existing chemical in our brain called acetylcholine, which is a chemical that we have. We have less of it as we get older. We have even less of it when we develop cognitive problems. If you can help to maintain these levels, then you're going to keep people thinking at the same level longer. You don't cure it. It doesn't improve it, but it helps to prevent decline. Probably the most well-known medicine back then was called Aricept. There's also another class of medicines which can work with the Aricept kinds of medicines, works on a different part of the brain. But then back in the late 1990s, everyone turned to looking at a substance in our brains that's found in people with Alzheimer's disease to a greater extent, and it's called beta amyloid. And we've known about this being in the brains of people with dementia back since the early 1900s. In fact, Louis Alzheimer's is credited with finding these plaques in the brains of the people that he did autopsies on. He actually was second to the party. There's a little story behind that, but there's actually somebody else who had figured that out before him. He just became more famous about it. Anyway, we got into this whole thing of removing or preventing the accumulation of these plaques. thinking that if we could do that, we could then reverse Alzheimer's. So they did this with mice. They genetically engineered. Their brains were like those of people with Alzheimer's. And it worked. You remove the plaques and the mice began to learn. We thought, wonderful, let's do this with people. So over the last 25 years, they've tried this. They have now 2 medications which both have recently received accelerated FDA approval. One's called aducanumab, otherwise known as Aduhelm. The other was known as lecanemab, which has another, I think, called Quimby or something. The problem is these medications do not really reverse any of the damage that's already done. We're not even sure if they actually slow it down to a great extent. And they have some pretty significant side effects with brain swelling and possibly some loss of brain size. Most recently came out just a couple of days ago. The other problem is that they're extremely expensive. We're talking about $25,000 a year for infusions. So my thinking on this and Emily's thinking on this is we're barking up the wrong tree. We should not be working so hard to remove plaques. We should be working on many of the other areas that are still in early stage trials. It's not so hopeful, at least immediately, and that's why our focus again is back on prevention as opposed to treatment. I think it's a 2-pronged approach. You got to treat the people who have it. You got to prevent it in the people who don't.
He is Dr. Mitchell Clionsky. The book is Dementia Prevention: Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. Doctor, what is the website?
The website is braindoc.com, BRAINDOC, braindoc.com, and our social media handles are 2braindocs, the number 2. So you'll see us posting a bunch of stuff in the next couple of weeks.
Outstanding. And the book is available everywhere, correct?
As of Tuesday, April 4th, everywhere. Yep. Including on Kindle and iPad, the Apple Store, and including at the end of May, an audiobook will be coming out by a very talented reader named Nan McNamara. So watch for that if you like to listen to audiobooks.
Outstanding. And Doctor, anything else you'd like to add?
Just that we want people to be active. This is an opportunity to spread the word, to actually change the future. As we say in the book, don't be a dementia worrier, become a prevention warrior. Do something today.
Outstanding. And thank you for your work, you and your wife. He is a survivor of co-writing a book with his spouse, so that in itself is a pretty good feat. Doctor, thank you for the time, and I appreciate the work.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. For Dr. Mitchell Clionsky, I'm Kenny Graves on Willie 1550 and 98.7.